Hello, hello. Welcome back to Mentally a Badass. Today we have Susan Snow. She is the daughter of slain LAPD Detective Thomas C. Williams, who was ambushed and killed on October 31st, 1985, when she was just 17 years old. She is a published author, speaker, and coach. Susan currently works as a realtor in the Denver metro area. So, welcome to the podcast. It's so awesome to have you today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes,
Appreciate it.
absolutely. First off, I was reading through your story, and the first sentence I read through, and I was like, that must be like really, hard to go through, having a father that was, ambushed and killed in 1985. So let's go back into the past here. And can you take us back to that Halloween night and share like what happened? How did that moment alter your life and the life of your family?
Sure. Well, like you said, I was 17 years old. And I will say, so that day, my dad was actually a detective. So he was going to court for a case that he was working on. He was the lead detective on. And so that morning, he was getting ready to go to court. And we had had a little bit of a disagreement because I was a teenager and it was Halloween night and I wanted to go to a party. And so I approached him and he said, "Nope, you can't go because it's a school night. We don't go to parties on the school nights." So, of course, the day started out with a little bit of frustration. And he dropped me off at school. And my mom dropped I had a 6-year-old brother at the time. My mom dropped him off, and my dad would drop me off at school. And all day, I just was planning all of the manipulating things that I can do to my parents to allow me to go to this party. So when I got home, I I cleaned the entire house. Um, I'm sure there's people out there that have done this. Like, if I clean the house, they'll let me go to the party.
Yeah.
So I was getting ready for the night. My mom came home and she was in her costume and she went to go take care of that. The phone rang and I bolted over to the phone and picked it up thinking it was just for me. And it was a lady from my brother's school. And all she said to me was that there was a drive-by shooting and my dad was involved. Immediately, my mom kind of came around the corner and I handed her the phone. And I watched her demeanor as she was on the phone and she was talking to this woman. And I could just see in her body language that it was not good. And she got off the phone, looked at me, and said, "We're going to the school." So we got in the car and said nothing to each other all the way there. Once we got to the school, the way that the layout of the school is that there's a front of the school, there's the back of the school, and in the middle is a parking lot. So we parked in the parking lot in the middle, and all the kids and after school care got out on the back side of the school. So that's where we headed. As we headed there were 2 police officers walking towards us, and they had tears in their eyes. And as we kept walking past them, all I saw were the lights of all the police units that were lined in the street. And then there was one ambulance that sat there motionless. It wasn't doing anything. My mom and I caught from the side of our eye, we caught my dad's truck. So we started to run towards the truck. As we got closer to the truck, we saw glass on the ground and we rounded the corner. And that's where we saw my dad. And he was partially covered up, but he was where he lay. And my mom, I watched her drop to her knees and scream. And I stood there in the street. I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. So I fixated on the ambulance. And my brain kept saying to myself, like, why aren't they helping him? Why is that ambulance just sitting there? Why isn't anyone helping him? And soon, pretty quickly, we had officers that took us away from the scene and took us into an office in the school. At that point, my mom was taken aside by some detectives, and I sat in the office by myself. And as I was sitting there, I was just not able to comprehend everything that was going on. And like my head was just spinning. I could not put two and two together. It wasn't until I heard two women in the office talking to each other that they worked at the school. And the one lady said to the other that my dad was deceased. And it hit me. It's like my world cracked. And I wanted to get up out of that chair and run as fast and as far as I could go. But my legs felt like cement. I couldn't move physically at all. And as I sat there, I was wondering where my brother was. Was he hurt? I had no idea where my 6-year-old brother was. I didn't know what he saw. My mom came back to me and she said, I'm sending you with a neighbor. So even though as I sat there, I wanted to run far, part of me I was a child and I still wanted that security of my family unit. I wanted to stay. I wanted to be with my mom. I wanted to be with my brother. And I didn't get that chance. So that night I felt like I was absolutely crushed. Obviously, it was completely earth shattering for me. And this poor neighbor of ours had known us for years and knew my parents. And she was trying to wrap her head around what was going on. Our neighborhood turned into something completely different. It was a very quiet street, and now it was filled with police cruisers up and down the street. We heard the helicopters above, and this poor lady had no idea how to support me other than to hug me and tell me that it was going to be okay. But I knew in my heart it wasn't going to be okay. And the only person I wanted at that very moment was my boyfriend. I get emotional because we've been together. I'll tell you, but we've been together all these years. Because I didn't have, the parent, I didn't have my mother with me. I didn't have any adults that really knew how to support me in the way that I needed. He showed up when the neighbor called him at work, and he showed up and he didn't get any information. So when he showed up, he's just, grab your purse, grab your jacket. What hospital is he at? I'm going to take you there. Let's go, and my feet were cement. I couldn't spit out the words. And after a little bit of him trying to get me to leave, I finally blurted it out that he was gone. And he said, "What do you mean he's gone?" And I said, "He's gone. He's not at a hospital. He's not coming back. He's gone." And I watched this. He was 19 at the time. I watched this 19-year-old drop to his knees. And we'd only been dating 3 months when this happened, but he got to know my dad in that 3 months. And it was just as devastating to him. And so that night, it was just a real struggle for us because all of the adults were doing their thing, right? When we were finally able to go home, I still didn't know where my brother was. I assumed that when I got into the house, I could hear my mom's voice. So I assumed that he was home, but there were so many people in my house, just filled with, now I know they were dignitaries and people from Los Angeles Police Department and advocacy or, victim units and all that kind of stuff. But I just wanted to hide. I wanted to do what a teenager would do, is just hide in the room and completely disassociate from everything that was going on around me. And so that's what I did. I just hid in my room, hoping that no one would come and ask me. And as I walked through the house, nobody did. It was like I was a ghost. I was able to just walk by and nobody knew who I was.
First, I want to say a couple of things. First, I'm so sorry for your loss, and second, you have so much courage to talk about that night and to go through that night because, going through that, you do, as we're going to talk about later in this episode about PTSD, one of the hardest things about someone, having PTSD is going through that night again.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were talking about it, I'm like watching you face to face, and I'm I'm listening and then feeling like I'm feeling the emotions because I'm also empathetic.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also just thinking in the back of my head, I'm like, wow, she has so much courage. Like, how amazing is that? And I know that you bring your story onto so many other podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to first just applaud you for that. Like, that's amazing that you're doing that. And, you talking about this also gives an awareness on how this, gun violence affects a family, which I feel
Mm-hmm.
like gun violence is a big topic that we should talk about in this country and just like how it affects, families and such. And I never spoke to somebody who has lost somebody due to gun violence. Like, of course, I hear about it in the news. You see things on, TV. But I never ever sat down with somebody and their story. And you're an amazing storyteller because you were able to really bring me along to that night, which is why I was kind of feeling those emotions as well. But just like I said, I just want to just let you know, put that on the table before I start talking about more things.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important. I tell my story because I feel like I try that's my purpose, is to be able to give people a safe space to tell theirs. Um, it's a part of the healing journey. Unfortunately, back then there was no talk of mental health. This was 1985, way before you were born. I'm sure. I back then there was no talk of mental health. There was
Mhm.
there was very little known about PTSD.
Yes.
I hate the D, by the way. I hate the disorder part.
Oh,
So I'm going to
yes.
say
People
post
have,
trauma. Yep.
yeah,
I'm going
yeah.
to say
Actually,
post trauma. So there was like, even back then it was called shell shock, and it was only
oh.
attributed to people who came back from the war and were in the military. There definitely was no resources for kids at all. And at the time, all the things that happen when you go through post trauma, there's different things that can arise. So for me personally, when it first happened, I went through extreme anxiety, and I was having anxiety attacks and didn't understand what they were. I just thought that I was dying most of the time, because I always was like tingly and clammy, and I felt it was hard to breathe, and I felt like my heart was pounding out of my chest most of the time. And back then, the only thing that I could do to calm myself is to put music on, right? And just try to distract my brain.
Mhm.
Because again, I didn't have the tools. I didn't understand how to regulate my nervous system. So the secondary thing that happened was I stopped sleeping. Um, I had extreme sleep deprivation. And I think a lot of that too is that because my dad was a detective, I had this false sense of security. Because he would come in after the fact. He wasn't out on the street in the direct danger. So trying to think about the fact that this happened to someone who wasn't in direct danger was another trauma on top of what I saw and what I was dealing with. So, and on top of that, prior to my dad's death, my mom and I's relationship was not healthy. And so my dad was always the go between, the voice of reason. And the present parent, the one that would really listen to me and make me feel like I was the most important thing in the world, right?
Mhm.
And so my mom kind of did her own thing, right? And obviously, all of the focus was on my brother and my mother. And so be it, because my brother watched his father get murdered and my dad saved his life. That was the last thing he did on this earth, was to save my brother's life. So, of course, all the focus was going to be on them, right? However, on top of the anxiety, on top of the depression, on top of all of this other stuff, and the focus being on him and my mom, and even the media took 2 days to figure out he had a teenage daughter. I had this sense of I was not important in this scenario, which kind of perpetuated the suicidal ideation for me, which I didn't know what suicidal ideation was. All I knew is that I wanted to be with my dad like every day. um, I really struggled with that. And even my boyfriend, like, he knew some of this stuff, but he didn't know all of it.
Yeah.
I think really early on, I just learned it wasn't being brave. It was learning how to have the mindset of I'll be fine. Like I'm going to figure this out. And like I said, back then there was no talk about mental health. However, about a month after my dad was killed, um, LAPD came to my mom and said, we would like to pay for therapy for all three of you separately. And so at the time, when you are in a fog, which is what I was, and you're just kind of functioning, or barely functioning, I should say, in your grief, you just push me in the way that you wanted me to go, and I went that way. So my mom came to me and said, they said we should go to therapy. You're going to therapy. I thought, okay, all right. And even then, I didn't know what a therapist was. I thought if you went to someone like that, you were crazy. And because that's what a child would think, right? So
Yeah. And that's what was always
I,
said too.
yeah, I mean, it wasn't a thought, right?
Mhm.
So I just said, okay, I will do this. Maybe this person will help me. Maybe this person will make me feel better, because I feel horrible every day. And I started to see this gentleman, and I will tell you that I don't know in hindsight. I just feel like back then there was not enough known about post trauma and extreme post trauma, to be honest. I feel like he wasn't, I call it trauma competent or informed, for that matter. And
Yeah, I
so
heard
our
that.
therapy sessions were so shallow. They were
Hmm.
just, talking points on my relationship with my mom, my brother, my boyfriend, and school. And that's it. He never even once, I tell people this and they like fall out of their chair. He never once asked me how that night affected me. And being 17, I could not verbalize all that was going on with me. I didn't know how. And part of me thought, oh gosh, if I tell this guy what I'm going through or whatever, he's just going to think I'm crazy. And then he's going to put me in a hospital. You know what I mean? Like you start putting all this stuff in your head. So
Yeah.
I didn't know how to verbalize. I didn't know how to tell him all the things that I was dealing with. And I saw him for an entire year.
Wow.
At the end of the year, and every session, every week I went, I was like, today's the day. Today's the day. He's going to help me today, right? And I'd walk out of there thinking, it's just no hope. Year later, he looked at me and said, Susan, you're a well-rounded young lady, and you're going to be fine for the rest of your life. and I don't need to see you anymore. And I walked out of that session and I said to myself, okay, I'm crazy. That's it. I've cracked. This is the way I'm going to live for the rest of my life. And even a professional can't help me. So I'm just going to have to figure this out on my own. And what I ended up doing is I looked to see what was going on with my mom. My brother was so young that, we all dealt with everything differently. And I don't blame her for how she dealt with things, but her coping mechanism was drinking, which increased the abuse that I received and that my brother received. And another trauma on top of my trauma. But I looked at that and I said, I don't want that for myself. However, what I chose was called the emotional mask. When people would say to me, oh, Susan, you're so brave. You're so strong. You're so resilient, right? That was my mask. I was a hot mess inside, but everybody outside of me saw happy Susan, nice Susan, pleasant Susan, brave Susan. And I got really good at that. Meanwhile, I was living in fight or flight.
Mm-hmm.
And that took a lot away from my life and my relationships with people, including my own husband, including my own children when I had them, because I didn't know how to be me authentically.
Yeah.
I was still that scared little girl for so many years, 14 to be exact. And when we decided we were moving out of Southern California and we moved to Colorado, I had married the boyfriend.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask that.
I had 2 kids, and we came to Colorado in 97. And April 20th of 1999, I was working as a hairdresser in a salon that was close to Littleton, Colorado. And was doing my clients, took a break, went into the back room, turned on the TV, and all of the coverage for the Columbine high school shootings was going on. I had a physical, visceral reaction to what I was seeing on TV. And remember, I was told I was going to be fine for the rest of my life. So I couldn't understand why I was having a panic attack, why I felt clammy, why I felt anxious, as I was watching this, and even my coworkers, I never told them my story. So they had no idea what was going on with me either. And they knew that I was too young to have high school kids. So they were confused. I was confused. I knew that I had to finish my day. So I did what I do best. I put my mask back on. Everybody around me was like upset and crying and all the things, but I had my mask on. So I just pretended that it was not affecting me at all. As soon as I left that day and I walked through those doors, everything came flooding back. All of the old feelings, all of the old emotions, suicidal ideation. On one end, I was planning how I was going to take my life. On the other end, I was having this fight in my brain because now I'm a mom. And part of me didn't want to feel this pain anymore. And part of me didn't want to leave my kids. And I struggled. I stopped sleeping. And finally, my very smart man stopped me at the door one day and he said, you have 2 choices. You either get help or I'm putting you in a hospital today. And I said, okay, I raised the white flag and I went in and I saw a physician, and that physician put me on antidepressants because that's what they do. And then he handed me a business card and he said, I want you to make an appointment with this therapist. And I literally laughed in this guy's face. I said, I tried this 14 years ago and it did not work for me. What makes you think that this is going to help? And he said, here's the thing, you don't have any choice. So I said, all right, fine. And I made an appointment and I went and saw this woman, and thank God I did, because this woman specialized in post-trauma, extreme, severe post-trauma. And she was totally trauma competent. Like, she knew in the first 3 minutes of telling her what I had gone through at 17 and what I was currently dealing with, she looked me in the face and she said, Susan, everything that you have gone through since you were 17 is normal because you have PTSD. And I looked at her and I was like, wait a minute, what? How can I have PTSD? Come on. I wasn't in the military. I didn't go to war. And she said, no, no, no. Anyone who has gone through anything traumatic can experience PTSD. But what you need to know about PTSD is that it doesn't go away. It's something you learn to manage. And I was like, holy cow. I always describe it like the sky opened up and rainbows shot out, because for the first time in my 14 years of dealing with all of this stuff, I had hope. I knew I wasn't nuts. I wasn't crazy, that there was someone that could help me finally. I found my person that can help me and guide me, and there would be healing. And I had so much hope, and I was so grateful, so grateful. But she knew she had her hands full because there were so many things that I was dealing with, but she didn't want to dive into all of them all at once. So we ended up just taking what was imperative now, which at the time was my sleep deprivation. And she'd ask me, what happens when you go to sleep? What happens when you're getting ready for bed? Where is your mind? And I said, I become anxious when I know it's bedtime, when it's nighttime. And she said, why do you become anxious? And I said, because when I close my eyes, I see that night, or I have horrible dreams and I don't feel safe. And and I just started spewing all of these things that circle my head. And she said, okay, well, here's what we're going to do right off the bat. She said, there's something called journaling that I want you to do before you go to bed. Some people write, some people do music, some people use art. But what I want you to do is utilize a modality to get everything that's swirling around in your head out before you go to sleep. And I looked at her like, are you kidding me? Like, what? I was such a skeptic. I was like, that is not going to help. Like, come on now. She says, well, you can just try it. Just try it. We'll meet next week. You can tell me how it goes. And I said, fine, whatever. Well, I've always tended to be more on the writer side. So I got a pad of paper and a pen, and I kept it by the bed, and I put an alarm clock on because we didn't have cell phones back then. I put the alarm clock on, and it would tell me when I would needed to do what I needed to do. And I would just write. She gave me a couple prompts. I would just write everything that was swirling around in my head. I did this for 2 nights in a row. And by the second night, I slept like a baby. And I woke up the next morning and I was like, that did not happen. I had to realize that this one tiny little thing that I did made such a huge difference for me. And, it didn't cost me $1 million to do it. And it was just a baby step into my healing. So when I met with her the next week, she goes, okay, tell me what happened. And like everything in my being was like, I don't want to tell her it worked. We're just like
Stubborn there. Like, I don't want to admit
a little
that
bit.
she's right.
Yeah. But she says, well, you look good. Like your skin tone looks good. Cause man, when I went to see her, I was not looking very good.
You're stressed.
I was stressed. I was like pale. Yeah. And she said, well, you look good. And I said, well, yeah, I took your advice. And by the second night, I was sleeping. So I've been sleeping for about 5 nights. And she said, great, keep doing that. We're going to keep doing that. And then we're going to add one more thing. So I said, okay. So then we started talking about my anxiety and when I have panic attacks and how I was going to work that. Initially, we started working with breath work, so breathing techniques to actually calm the nervous system. And I teach people these things because I think it's really important to know how to regulate yourself, especially when you're feeling overwhelmed. If you could believe this, I'm teaching a lot of people how to do this right now because of our environment. It's a little bit stressful. So that was, we just kind of hit on each of the mental things that were going on with me. So the anxiety, and then as we progressed, then she introduced me to EMDR, but I had to lead up to that. EMDR is a very intense type of cognitive therapy, and it really takes you back to that traumatic moment. So a lot of people get really nervous about doing that by refeeling those feelings and being in that space. She didn't take me through that. She gave me a referral for someone who does that all the time. And I felt like I was in a safe space. And I think that's the most important bit of advice I tell people is if you truly want to heal and you're afraid of that healing journey, here's what I want to tell you. It is your healing journey. It is not theirs. So the first thing that you need to do is interview your therapist. Make sure that they are competent in whatever trauma you've gone through. Because there's a lot of practitioners that will lump everybody together. And you can't. Everybody is an individual. I don't compare my trauma to anyone else, right? Your trauma is your trauma. Your journey is your journey. So I think it's really important that people take the time out to ask questions of your therapist. Ask them, is this a specialty for you? Is this something that you have done? What are the modalities that you use that allows the healing to come a little faster or, whatever? It's just important because, if you're not with the right person, the healing will not truly happen. You will become frustrated. I can't tell you how many times people say, oh, I tried therapy, it didn't work. And I always say the same thing. It's because you didn't find your person. When you find your person and the healing starts to happen, I can tell you it is an amazing space to be in.
Yeah. I've been through so many therapists, like I can't even count how many. And I started going to therapy since I was 15. And I saw a therapist from the age of 15 to 18. Like my mom, I think, just took me to a therapist. And it was just a pretty much just like, oh, how was school today? Or what happened at home? And it was just a lot of that. And then, I mean, clearly it didn't work since I like was self-harming the whole time. It didn't stop. So I didn't talk about that in the sessions, the self-harming part. That was like my secret until I got caught when I was 17. Then I had to go to a psychiatrist. But as you were saying, like I had a similar experience, and it just like I didn't say anything to my mom, like, oh, I wasn't really doing anything. I guess I just thought that's how therapy was. And so I went through the same thing, like, oh, I guess I'm just crazy, or like I literally went through the same thought process. And I'm so glad you're mentioning that, because I want people to know that just because a therapist can't help you doesn't, first of all, people are like, no, people aren't crazy. Like,
Mm-mm.
it's going, going to therapy and working on yourself, working on the human brain, which is like the most the complex organ that
Mm-hmm.
literally like dictates how our life goes. And it's like the tower, the center of everything,
Mm-hmm.
in our life. Like, taking charge of that and healing that, because there's a lot of crap that people go through. And half the time they don't even, like, outside of what you went through, which is a very severe traumatic event, there's also a lot of other things that people don't even realize that is trauma.
Right.
Like,
Oh,
have
I
you
have
heard?
those questions. I have
Yeah.
those conversations all the time. And it's very interesting. I I took up Lyft driving, okay, last
Mhm.
year. Real estate got a little funky when interest rates went up. So I started to Lyft drive. And what I found is, one, I kept my book in my car. And every time someone picks up my book and starts to kind of read it, it opens up a conversation. I've had women who, and I think this is a really important point, especially when there are people out there that are utilizing, or their coping skill is drugs or alcohol, right?
Mhm.
Um, I met this woman who was on her way to rehab. And when she picked up my book and she said, "Oh my gosh, I've never had trauma like this. I don't have that much. And I don't know why I drink. I, you know, but I feel really bad about myself." And so we had a conversation with her, and it broke my heart, her answer to this. But I said, "Why are you going to why are you going to rehab?" And she said, "This is my third time. The last two times I went were for my kids. This time I want to go for myself." And I said, "Okay." I said, "What is your ultimate goal?" And she said, "My ultimate goal is to be able to wake up and smile." And it broke my heart. So I felt the need to start to have a deeper conversation with her. Ends up being a coaching. I end up
I'm the
coaching.
same way.
It just happens. So what I found out about her was that she was the victim of molestation at a very young age by her mother's boyfriend. It was a normal event that happened in their family. It was, her cousins had it done to them. It was her entire family unit. So for her, she didn't see that as trauma, because for her, that was normal. That's how you show people love, right? And so I asked her point blank, "Have you ever told anyone your story?" And she said, "Nope, you're the first one." And and she's telling me the story. I felt like I was going to crush my car, because it was so heartbreaking to hear this grown woman who has struggled with everything from, her teenage years, not knowing anything about herself, being very promiscuous because of it, and then just feeling really nasty about herself, and then finding, that alcohol was the only way that she could hide from it, but it would come right back. So I said to her, and I said, you can take my advice or not. It's completely up to you. But here's what I'm going to say. When you go to rehab this time, tell your story. Tell your story. And I want you to tell your story, because if they can align you with a therapist, a psychiatrist, or whoever that can help you work through that, your trauma and your stackable trauma at best, sobriety is going to be easier to attain. if you don't target the reason behind the using, then sobriety is going to be harder to attain. And she just looked at me with tears in her eyes. And I felt like, first of all, that conversation was bigger than both of us. Okay.
Hmm.
I felt like I was just the vehicle for this message. But it was an aha moment for me because I thought that people knew that they went through trauma. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I really did. I really felt like if you went through something traumatic, you knew you went through something traumatic. But there are people out there because it was their daily surrounding environment that don't realize that it was traumatic. There's people that don't realize, myself, who are in a narcissistic abuse situation, right? And that's me. And it took me 54 years to figure that out. And that's my mother. So, it's one of those things where when you start to heal from certain things, you start to open your eyes to what is truly real, right? I have a chapter in my book called Rose Colored Glasses because I walked around with them. I didn't see what was right in front of me, which were not great relationships, people who didn't treat me very well, including my own husband at one point. So it was, it opens you up. And and that's when you start to feel the resiliency. That's when you start to feel like, okay, I'm finally getting to the place where I want to be, the person I want to be, right? But it takes work and the work sucks. It is not easy. It is not. And I'm not going to candy coat it. But I will tell you that if you really want to heal from your trauma, you got to do the work. And it's for yourself. And you should be the priority. And you're not alone, So,
I was thinking in my head that it is like lifelong.
mhm,
In my opinion, like I've been
mhm,
working on my mental health ever since I was diagnosed with bipolar. And so that was when I was 17, which kind of like around that we're both 17 when like, I mean, 17 is an interesting age for the both of us.
yep,
But yeah, I went through like different phases too, like,
mhm,
and another thing too is that like healing is not linear. Like
no.
you can be doing so well and then there's like you kind of go
Oh,
back and
yeah.
then it's like yeah,
Good
so
days and bad days. You
oh
might have
yeah,
something else traumatic happen,
yeah,
and I talk about that in my book. I've had multiple traumas in my life. The difference is the first time I had no tools.
yeah.
So I guess the blessing in the healing is this: when
Mhm.
something does come up for you and you have the tool, you're able to have a little more control over how you react to things, or there's no cut and dry. There's no one size fits all, right? But if you know what works for you and it's in a healthy realm, it does. It makes you feel like you have a little bit more control over things that come up, emotional responses and negative self talk and all of those things. Because a lot of that stuff is wrapped around fear.
Ooh, yeah.
Fear is a big culprit of everything, right? People are fearful. I was fearful. Like when I first wrote my book, I had so many fears around it. One of the fears was that it was going to destroy what was left of my mom and I's relationship, right? One of it was, was it going to destroy the relationship between my husband and I? And the third one, and a big one, was my safety, because some of the men that were involved are still in prison. And, me putting myself out there again was scary. It was scary. However, when I sat back and I really like thought about my fears, I said to myself, there's the message is so important. There are people out there that need to hear my message, that need to hear my story, that need to have hope and knowing that they're not alone. And so anytime those fears started to well up, I thought of my purpose. And my purpose were those faceless people out there that needed to hear hope, that needed to feel like I felt the first time I met with my therapist, my person that started my journey. And I wanted to be that person in some sort of way. So anytime I had that fear, that's what allowed me. And I have this tagline, bulldoze your fear. I would bulldoze through it, because yes, those things are scary, and yes, those things are bad, but at the same time I felt like the purpose was more important. And so that's what you have to like kind of put your big why, whatever that is for you, right? I had several big whys. One, I wanted to change the legacy for my children, and I wanted it to turn into taking something horrible and turning it into something that was positive for my kids. I think that, whatever the case is, initially, the one person that you need to wrap your head around is you. Everybody around you will heal when they see you healing. So it's kind of a ripple effect.
Mm-hmm.
Just like if they see you spiraling, if they see you in a self-destructive mode, right? That ripples out as well. I think it's really important for people to like really take the time to heal yourself. It is so worth it. You are so worth it. And the suicidal ideation stuff and all of that, we talk about that being temporary. It is. It is. I think the one part that I can say, when I talk about that part of my life, is that I know that feeling. And when you're able to take the fear out of letting someone in, that's when you can find someone to come alongside you and remind you of how loved you are and that you're worth it and that you deserve to have a future. You deserve that. So yeah, I mean, I think that's such a huge message that I try to put out for people to understand that, it is a priority for you to take care of yourself and your mental health. And it's important. And I talk to law enforcement about this. I talk to everybody about this, vets, anyone who will listen to me, I will make sure that, they understand that their mental health and them, they're important, and there are people that love you and they would be absolutely devastated if you were no longer here. So please stay. And everybody deserves to have a beautiful life, whatever that is for them. And, yeah, so that's where my book came from. That was my labor of love. It took me 4.5 years to write it. The reason it did is because I had to dive and relive and feel all the feels and give myself grace. I gave myself grace on the days where I had nothing left. And I went and I did something that gave me joy on those days. And I think that's important. If you have a day where you just have nothing left, that's fine. Give yourself grace. Go do something that you love for yourself without any guilt.
Yeah, I was just thinking that when you actually like just said what was going through my mind, how it's so important that it's okay. There's some days that are just, that are bad. I mean, it's not meant to have every single day that's supposed to be fantastic. So, what I was saying in my head is like, yeah, give yourself some grace, and it's okay if you need to take a step back. And I was going to usually I always like end the episode by asking my guests to like if any more like last piece of advice, but I feel like you pretty much nailed that. You had like a whole fantastic message, and the biggest takeaway is emphasizing how important it is to heal. And you gave all of the right tools today and all of, such amazing advice. And I really do appreciate it. And I hope people who are
Oh,
listening first hearing your story, because that's super important, and then you gave us a lot today, and I think that's fantastic. But I do want to mention to the audience like the name of your book.
The Other Side of the Gun, My Journey from Trauma to Resiliency.
Okay.
And it is available on Amazon. It is in paperback form or
Mhm.
Kindle form. I am working to get in a studio to do it audio. And yeah, I mean it's 188 pages, so it's an easy read.
Mhm.
Easy that it's short, not easy read. But it's an important message, and I hope that anyone who reads it can connect with it in some sort of way. So
That's awesome. Well, I want to say thank you so much for coming on here. I really do appreciate you.
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And for everyone who's listening, hope you guys have a good rest of your day and stay tuned for next week's episode.